So in previous videos, we talked about how there are some pretty clear-cut cases where we can explain someone's thoughts and behaviors in terms of basically only nature or only nurture. For example, with Huntington's disease, the symptoms that develop are because of the person's genetics. In contrast, something like the type of language they learn, like whether they speak English or Japanese, that's something that's caused by the environment that they grow up in. But most psychological characteristics are not that clear cut. Most of them are the result of an interaction between both nature and nurture. And I want to give an example of that. And the example I want to use has something to do with the food that we eat. So a lot of our foods have proteins in them, and these proteins are made up of smaller molecules called amino acids. There are a bunch of different kinds of amino acids, and the one in particular I want to talk about is this one called phenylalanine. Now, you don't need to remember the names of these things. The point is just that we're talking about a molecule that is naturally and normally in lots of foods that we eat, such as milk and many kinds of meat and soybeans and eggs. So phenylalanine is a molecule we normally consume as part of our diet. And it's actually an important molecule that our bodies need. So there's nothing wrong with it. Now, in most people, we have a gene, and this gene makes an enzyme. And the job of this particular enzyme is to break down the phenylalanine that we eat. An enzyme isn't anything fancy. It's basically what we're saying here is we have a gene makes a molecule, and this molecule helps us break down this other molecule that we eat. But in some people, the gene that makes this enzyme, this particular type of molecule, isn't working. And so these folks who have this particular defective gene, they can't make that enzyme. And because they can't make the enzyme, they also can't break down the phenylalanine normally when they consume it. So suppose that a person with this defective gene drinks a lot of milk, for example. Well, in that case, they can actually build up toxic levels of phenylalanine. When the body doesn't break down phenylalanine normally, it instead ends up getting converted into molecules called phenylketones. And so this is a condition where you have this defective gene. It's a condition called phenylketonuria, or PKU. Now, that's a fancy sounding name, but basically it just means there are these molecules called phenylketones that start showing up in the person's urine. That's what the urea part of it means. And this is one of the ways you can tell that this is happening. So if you have a newborn who has PKU because of this defective gene, that newborn can end up with toxic levels of phenylalanine and be unable to break those down. And these toxic levels can have a big impact on their brain development. And in fact, they can even lead to severe intellectual disability. In some cases, it can even end up where the person has an abnormally small head, or what is called microcephaly. But the interesting thing is that we now have a blood test that we can use in a newborn to check for phenylketonuria. And if we see that, we can change the newborn's diet. So we can say this infant instead doesn't get milk, and during a critical window of brain development, we limit anything in their diet, not just milk, but anything in their diet with high levels of phenylalanine. And if we do that, what will happen then is that this same individual, same genetics, can have totally normal brain development. So notice that we have nature playing a role here. Whether you have this defective gene and are unable to make this enzyme, that is up to nature, and it just depends on what genes your parents happened to pass on to you. But after that point, the rest of this process is nurture. In one environment, we don't detect the PKU, and we continue to give you milk and other foods that contain PKU. In the other, we do detect the PKU, and we modify your diet. And which of these environments you end up in determines whether you then have normal brain development or end up with a significant intellectual disability. So remember, as psychologists, what we're asking is what causes people to think the way they think, to behave the way they behave? And in this context, we're particularly asking, does this person behave a certain way because of nature or because of nurture? Well, if this person has phenylketonuria, if they have PKU and they end up with with abnormal brain development, then the answer has to be both. It has to be that it was an interaction of both nature and nurture that caused them to end up the way they are today. Now, the big thing to take away from this isn't remembering how to spell phenylketonuria or any of the specifics about the enzymes and the amino acids, but rather it's just to give you a clear example where a person's behavior can be caused in a very clear-cut way by an interaction between their genes and their environment. It is impossible to explain this with just genes or just environment. You have to have both to explain the result you get. And the truth is that most psychological characteristics are like this to one degree or another. Most thought and behavior that humans exhibit can only be fully explained as a result of an interaction between these two things. So when someone asks you, is it nature or is it nurture? The answer is almost always both. And the real question then is how much? So how much is it nature? How much is it nurture? And in what ways? And how exactly are the two interacting with each other to produce the result that you're seeing?